when David Sharp died near the summit of Mount Everest on the 15th of May 2006. It was just another tragic loss of a climber's life on the world's highest peak. Soon though, the media took up his story as a symbol of how commercialization and selfish pursuit of personal goals had led to a callous disregard for the lives of climbers who were in trouble. Controversy and heated debate followed. So what really happened that night on Everest? Sharp was an experienced rock climber who had previously summited Cho Oyu, reckoned to be the most straightforward of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. He was not a professional climber, but impressed the expedition leaders with his ability. Unfortunately, given what happened, he had a purist attitude to climbing, which bordered on the foolhardy. He didn't believe in using Sherpas, and wanted to summit without supplementary oxygen or emergency steroid shots. In a previous 2003 expedition to Everest, Sharp had been forced to turn back with frostbite before reaching the summit, and lost some of his toes. In 2006, he decided to climb Everest alone, and without supplemental oxygen. It is a strategy that even most professional climbers regard as far too risky. His bare-bones trip was booked through Asian trekking, with climber support ending after a certain altitude. He had 2 emergency bottles of oxygen, but no radio. 13 other independent climbers chose the same package, one of whom also died on the mountain. According to those who encountered him that year, he acclimatized well and followed the schedule properly. It is believed that sometime on the night of the 13th of May, he set out for the summit. He either reached the summit or turned back late in the day on the 14th and was forced to emergency bivouac at 8,000 meters in an overhang known as Green Boots Cave, so called because of the body that was visible there. It was one of the coldest nights of the season. Because of his climbing method, no one knew he was in trouble, although another independent climber realized by the 15th of May that he was missing. Sharp was first passed by climbers on their way to the summit in the early morning of the 15th of May. They mostly reported either not seeing him or believed him to be a body from a previous expedition year. A Turkish team, ascending in 3 groups, stopped for Sharp, but reported that he waved them on and seemed only to be taking a rest. When they discovered him again, at around 7 a.m. on the 15th of May, returning from the summit, they did try to help. 2 climbers stayed, gave him something to drink, and tried to get him moving. Limited in what they could do as they were helping one of their own team down the mountain, they placed radio calls to the other descending Turkish team members about Sharp's predicament before moving on. At about 8:30 a.m., 2 other Turks attempted to give Sharp oxygen, but as their own oxygen supplies depleted, they were forced to carry on. Finally, at 9 a.m., there was a concerted effort by Sherpas from the Hymex team and the final Turkish group to give Sharp oxygen and get him moving. Despite physically dragging him into a standing position, he could not move, and they were forced to abandon him. The controversy following his death came after a group of climbers from New Zealand were singled out for severe criticism in the media, including from the Everest pioneer himself, Sir Edmund Hillary. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. They had encountered Sharp at 1 a.m. on the 15th and did stop. Their group leader Mark Woodward knew that Sharp shouldn't be there, and also that he was still alive. They yelled at him to get up and follow the headlights back to camp, but received no response. Believing that he was in a coma, they moved on. The criticism alleged 2 things: that their group had not made a sufficient effort to help Sharp, and secondly, linked to that they had prioritized summiting over helping. This is not the established code for mountaineering, which holds that personal ambitions be abandoned to help climbers in trouble. It was particularly touchy because one of the group's members, Mark Inglis, was a double amputee and would a few hours later go on to be the first such person to summit Mount Everest. Critics were outraged at the possibility that media and personal glory influenced the decision to move on. This suspicion was bolstered by the presence of a film crew following the expedition. Inglis made a big mistake afterwards when he claimed that expedition leader Russell Bryce made a radio call from base camp instructing them to move on. Bryce was heavily criticised, but then revealed that detailed logs of radio calls showed that no such conversation took place, and that he was only notified of Sharp's predicament 8 hours later. The charitable explanation was that Inglis was confused by high altitude, although less charitable explanations are more widely believed. In many ways, David Sharp was the author of his own misfortune. Reports of his benevolent personality suggest that he wouldn't blame anyone for what happened to him, but these events reveal something disturbing about the mindset of at least some of the participants in Himalayan climbing expeditions. Sir Edmund Hillary said he believed many people climbing Everest were callous, saying, "I think the whole attitude towards climbing Mount Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top. They don't give a damn for anybody else who may be in distress. And it doesn't impress me at all that they leave someone lying under a rock to die. I think that their priority was to get to the top, and the welfare of a member of another expedition was very secondary." Hillary's criticism may seem a little harsh, or even unfounded, given that he wasn't there. Only the New Zealand team members truly know if they prioritised the summit over helping another climber in distress. To say that other climbers didn't help him either is a morally bankrupt argument. They did stop, they did make an effort, but was it all they could have done? And was the summit and personal achievement a stronger impulse than helping someone in serious trouble? There's no way Sir Edmund Hillary would have trudged on to the summit with a clear conscience had he been in the same position. The summit would have been the last thing on his mind. A few days later, Australian climber Lincoln Hall was rescued from a similarly dire position near the summit. The previous evening, his Sherpas had been forced to abandon him after he had fallen into a coma. The following morning, a summit bid led by the renowned high-altitude climber Dan Mazur discovered Hall alive. They immediately abandoned their summit attempt and remained for 4 hours to treat Hall until Sherpas from his team returned to help him down. Mazur said later, "The summit's still there and we can go back. Lincoln only has one life." Hall was conscious and intermittently able to walk when he was found. It's debatable if Sharp could have been revived to a similar state by the New Zealand team. We will never know. David Sharp's body was removed from view in 2007, and he remains on the mountain. Between the 6th and the 10th of August 1986, a mountaineering tragedy known as the 1986 K2 disaster took place. By the time the entire climbing season had finished, it would prove to be one of the deadliest periods ever on an 8,000-metre peak. Casualties ranged from the unlucky to the foolhardy, and wild storms cloaked the series of events on the mountain in mystery. K2 is located in the Pakistani part of the Karakoram Range. It is the world's second highest peak, but much more technical and dangerous than Mount Everest. 9 separate expeditions had been granted permission by the Pakistani government to scale the mountain that year, and base camp was awash with big-name climbers. Well-prepared high-quality teams from Britain, Poland, Austria, the US, France, Italy, and South Korea attempted a variety of routes, none of which were anything less than treacherous. The first tragedy took place on the 21st of June. The American team, one of many hoping to be the first to summit via the technically demanding and as yet unclimbed Southwest Pillar route, known as the Magic Line, were caught in an avalanche. Team leader John Smolik and Alan Pennington were killed. Smolik's body has never been recovered. The American team were in no mood to continue and headed for home. 2 days later, Polish climber Wanda Rutkiewicz became the first woman to summit K2, followed 30 minutes later by French woman Liliane Berard with her husband Maurice. The 6 team members in their group had summited late in the day, and the darkness and poor weather forced them to make an emergency bivouac overnight, not far from the summit. All survived that night, but the Berards disappeared in grim weather during the next day's descent. On the 10th of July, Polish team member Tadeusz Piotrowski was killed in a fall after summiting. On the 16th, Italian Renato Casarato fell into a crevasse. He was rescued, but died soon afterwards from his injuries. Another Pole, Wojciech Wrots, fell to his death from the end of a fixed rope after summiting on the 3rd of August. The next day, a local high-altitude porter, Muhammad Ali, was killed by falling rocks on the Abruzzi spur route. There were a litany of other incidents, near misses, brushes with death, and injuries, yet teams still carried on, as if oblivious to what seemed like a season filled with bad karma. By early August, attrition had led many of the remaining climbers to reformulate teams. The British team was down to team leader Alan Rouse and cameraman Jim Curran, who had headed back to base camp. Rouse partnered with Austrians Alfred Imitzer, Hannes Wieser, Willi Barr and Kurt Diemberger, Polish woman Dobroslava Wolf and Briton Julie Tullis. The new team made it to Camp 4, the last staging post before the summit, but for unknown reasons decided to wait a day until making a summit push. It was a fateful decision. Rouse and Wolf made for the summit on the 4th of August. Wolf dropped back, while Rouse continued. He was caught and passed by Barr and Imitzer, and all 3 summited around 4 p.m., Rouse becoming the first Briton to do so. On the way down, they encountered Diemberger and Tullis, who continued ascending despite efforts to persuade them that it was now too dangerous to continue. They summited around 7 p.m., but were forced to bivouac in the open as the weather closed in. Somehow, all the climbers made it back to Camp 4, but instead of the weather improving, it worsened considerably, and they were trapped at 8,000 meters. Out of food and fuel to melt snow, they got none of the required 6 liters of water per day needed to stave off the effects of extreme altitude. Tullis died overnight on the 6th to the 7th of high-altitude pulmonary edema. The other climbers remained trapped for another 3 days, but by the 10th of August, they realized they had to make a move or die. Rouse was left behind in Camp 4, as he was barely conscious and suffering from altitude sickness. There was stern criticism of this after the disaster, particularly directed at Diemberger, but Rouse's remaining teammate Curran defended him and fellow Austrian Willi Barr. Although they were in the best shape of the remaining team members, Curran asserted that there was absolutely no way they could have got Rouse off the mountain in that condition. Alone in a tent at base camp, recording events for a documentary, Curran was well aware of the dire situation above and had all but given up hope of anyone surviving. As they left Camp 4, Imitzer and Wieser collapsed almost immediately and could not be revived. Wolf was on the brink of death as well, and disappeared sometime during the descent. Her body was found a year later by a Japanese team, frozen in a standing position to a fixed rope. Diemberger and Barr reached Camp 3, but found it blown away by the storm. In a feat of superhuman endurance, they ploughed ahead to the relative safety of Camp 2, arriving late on the 10th of August. Barr continued on to base camp under his own steam, but Dienberger had to be helped down by Curran and 2 Polish climbers. Both would later lose multiple toes and fingers to frostbite. It is incomprehensible to non-climbers that such a disaster could be allowed to happen in a season that seemed cursed from the start. No amount of deaths or injuries seemed to discourage them from the goal of reaching the summit, and it was as though they were quite willing to pay the ultimate price to stand atop K2. Perhaps a combination of recklessness, ego, ambition, and summit fever took hold, when many others had decided that continuing was folly and headed for home. In the aftermath of the 1986 K2 disaster, the wise words of legendary climber Ed Viesturs never rang more true. Climbing is a round trip, getting to the top is optional, but getting back down is mandatory. In the summer of 2008, 22 years after the last major disaster on K2, the world's second highest and perhaps most dangerous mountain, 70 climbers from 15 expeditions arrived at the Great Peak. Little did they know that disaster would strike again. While no 2 climbing tragedies are ever exactly alike, many of the same flaws, both logistical and personal, would bring a calamity to K2 again that was every bit as bad as 2 decades before. Despite the presence of a multitude of cameras, it's still not entirely clear what happened on Summit Day, the 1st of August 2008. By that time, 25 climbers remained who would attempt to top out from Camp 4. Conditions were perfect when they set out. The only major obstacle on the way to the summit is the bottleneck, a tricky traverse at 8,200 metres, overhung by a giant sérac of ice, parts of which would occasionally, but not often, break away. Things looked set fair, although some disorganisation at Camp 4 had put them around an hour behind schedule. Then, as so often in the mountains, a chain reaction of events built towards disaster. Several members of the international team, amongst the last to set out for the top, arrived below the bottleneck and were bemused to find a huge queue of climbers ahead of them, barely moving at all. Believing that there was no chance to summit and get back before dark, they turned around. On the bottleneck, Alberto Zerain, a Basque solo climber in the lead, was inserting ice screws while others waited. It had been assumed that there would be rope already fixed all through the bottleneck, but rope had been fixed by the local high-altitude porters too close to Camp 4, and they had run out before the traverse could be secured. The rope had to be brought up again from below, costing them at least another hour. According to Lars Nesse of the Norwegian team, slower climbers and those who needed or wanted to rest had got ahead of some of the faster climbers, impeding the momentum through the bottleneck. As a result, climbers were having to pass each other on the fixed ropes. During one such manoeuvre, Serbian climber Dren Mandic slipped and fell 100 metres down the slope. He appeared to be okay, but then fell again. The Serbian team headed down to help, while the international team members who had turned around headed back up to assist. By the time they reached him, he had died. The Serbians enlisted the help of international team member Fredrik Strang and high-altitude porter Jihan Beg to slide Mandic's body back to Camp 4. During the effort, Beg, who had apparently been behaving erratically and may have had altitude sickness, slipped, trapping Strang on the rope with his body weight. Strang urged him to release the rope, but when he did, Big made no attempt to arrest the inevitable slide and careered off the slope to his death. This ended the attempt to bring Mandich down. After a short conversation, the remaining climbers on the bottleneck resumed their bid for the summit. This surprised those below, not only because of the deaths, but because the would-be summiters were now dangerously late, and at their current rate would be descending in darkness. However, the speedy Alberto Zerain forged ahead and reached the summit around 3:30 p.m, then headed back for the safety of Camp 4. The rest would make it to the top, but some at crazy late times, many at around 6:30. The Dutch Norrit team made it at 7:20 p.m, Italian Marco Confortola at 7:30, with daylight already fading. 18 in all summited on the 1st of August. Only 11 made the round trip. On the descent, the Norwegian team had almost crossed the traverse when a piece of the sérac fell, sweeping away team member Rolf By. His wife Cecile and Lars Nessa narrowly escaped and were able to finish the traverse without fixed ropes and make it back to Camp 4. The 15 climbers above them were now cut off. A group arrived shortly after, expecting to find the fixed rope. Initially unaware of the sérac fall, they searched for it until the realization came of what had happened. 2 options were available: free solo the traverse or bivouac for the night. Cas van de Gevel of the Norrit team set out across the void. He encountered French climber Hugues de Oberade already there. Seeming tired, he urged Cas to pass him. Moments later, a body flew past Van de Gevel, a fall claiming the life of the Frenchman. Pemba Gyalji Sherpa, a full climbing member of Norrit, set out across with a Korean team Sherpa, reasoning that to remain above the bottleneck was just too dangerous. 2 Korean team members also made it in the dark. A total of 7 got back to Camp 4 that night, leaving 13 on the mountain. Next morning, the remaining climbers on top of the sérac confirmed that the rope had gone. Wilco van Rooyen of Norrit was going snowblind and decided he must descend. As he did so, he encountered 2 Koreans and a Sherpa tangled in ropes from either a sérac fall or just a regular accident. After being told a rescue was on the way, he continued down. The Korean team leader had ordered 2 reluctant Sherpas up the hill to provide assistance. Irish climber Ger McDonnell had decided to descend along with Italian Marco Confortola, and they also encountered the entangled Korean team members. They decided to stay and assist. After some time, Confortola, exhausted and suffering from altitude sickness, concluded that they were beyond help. He descended, but McDonnell remained to help free them. At noon, the 2 Sherpas sent up to help the Koreans found Confortola on his hands and knees at the base of the bottleneck. Radioing their discovery to Pemba, they declined to bring him down, as they'd been ordered to continue. Pemba climbed up himself, gave Confortola oxygen, and got him moving back to Camp 4. By 2 p.m, the rescue Sherpas had reached the Korean team. They reported that they'd been freed, presumably by McDonnell, but that another climber, again, presumably McDonnell, had been hit by ice and fallen. Suddenly, there was a loud report of an avalanche. Pemba saw someone rolling past him. Then when the avalanche was over, he walked to where it had passed by, finding the bodies of 2 Koreans and 2 Sherpas. Van Rooyen was eventually found 18 hours later by Van de Gevel and Pemba. He had spent 60 hours in the death zone and would be the last man to come down alive. Both he and Confortola were later helicoptered off the mountain. The Italian was the first to face the media, who had by now descended on Pakistan. The tragedy had become a major international story. At first, Confortola's tale sounded entirely in keeping with everyone else's. As time went on and he returned to Italy, his story underwent several transformations, including an addition that MacDonald had succumbed to altitude sickness and become irrational. Given the terrible state that Confortola had been found in, and allowing for the heroism he showed in assisting the Korean team, it's perhaps best to conclude that he had little actual memory of what had really happened. Pemba was able to clarify some of the mysteries. Having seen the aftermath of the final fall, he concluded that the Koreans had been untangled, and that could only have been completed by MacDonald, whose act of supreme selflessness and heroism had cost him his life. He would almost certainly have made it down alive had he left with Confortola. Pemba spent 90 hours in the death zone, and for his efforts was named National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. Much comment followed the disaster. The summiters had flouted the safe turnaround time, but unlike 1986, the weather was incredibly good, maybe too good, as reports of warm sunshine may have dangerously weakened the Serac. Collectively, the teams had also turned a blind eye to poor organisation. Continuing on after Mandich's death also raised a few eyebrows. Pemba commented on a BBC Storyville documentary about the tragedy that the climbers were too optimistic and forgot too many things about safety. He also noted that he felt they should have turned around when the first fatality happened. It would be 3 years before K2 was climbed again, underscoring the difficulty and danger of the mountain, and perhaps underscoring the desperation of the climbers to get to the summit, given the all-too-rare perfect conditions that year. They knew this might be their only chance to stand atop the savage mountain, and they were willing to risk everything to get there. 8,000-metre mountains are famous for their dramatic stories of death at high altitude, but on the night of the 22nd of June, 2013, death came to Nanga Parbat in Pakistan, the world's 9th highest peak, in a way that no one could have anticipated. Over a dozen terrorists entered base camp, disguised as members of the local paramilitary force. By the time they left, 10 foreign climbers and a local cook were dead. It was at around 10 p.m. that night that the attack began. Zhang Jinchuan, a Chinese mountaineer who survived, described what happened. The incursion had been sudden, but he had managed to make a run for it, dodging gunfire in the process, before diving into a trench, where he remained for nearly an hour. Returning to camp when it was safe to do so, he called the police on a satellite phone, then retreated up the mountain in case of further attacks. A helicopter then arrived at 7 a.m. the following morning. Another survivor, Pakistani climber Sher Khan, described what happened in camp. The climbers were robbed of their money, radios and phones, then forced to turn their backs, before being shot. Making up the dead were 3 Ukrainians, 2 Slovakians, 2 Chinese, and 1 Chinese-American dual national, a Lithuanian, a Nepali guide, and a local man. Within that group were several notable climbers. Ivor Sverhun, the team leader, had climbed 6 8,000ers, while the Chinese, Chunfeng Jiang and Janfeng Rao, had climbed 11 and 10 respectively. The attackers had identified themselves as both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and as they left, were heard to shout Allahu Akbar and slogans in memory of Osama bin Laden. Gilgit-Baltistan, the Pakistani region in which Nanga Parbat is located, had previously been considered free from Islamic militancy, apart from a few internecine attacks on the minority Shia population. The Pakistani Taliban claimed responsibility the day afterwards, describing it as a retaliation for a May 2013 US drone strike in which Pakistani Taliban commander Wali-ur-Rahman had been killed. Yet another militant group, Jundallah, also claimed responsibility. Later intelligence further clouded the motives for the attack. It indicated that the perpetrators planned to kidnap the Chinese-American dual national Chen Hing-lu and hold him for ransom. However, Chen was a martial arts practitioner, and after fighting off his would-be kidnappers, one of them panicked and shot him. With the main objective now impossible, the terrorists decided to go for just a straight robbery and massacre instead. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. The Interior Minister of Pakistan, Nizar Ali Khan, announced an inquiry, along with a suspension of local law enforcement officials, for failure to protect the climbers. Shortly after an investigation was launched, 37 suspects were arrested from villages near Nanga Parbat. Most of them were porters, assisting the climbing expedition, and while none were involved in the attack, valuable information was obtained from them before they were released. This led to 16 attackers being identified. The men were local, and while not being immediately linked to the Pakistani Taliban, it emerged that they had received training 760 kilometers away in the so-called tribal areas, a known hotbed of Islamic extremism. Across June and July, police were able to track down and arrest 4 of the 16 men, but in August, the Pakistani Taliban attacked a car containing high-ranking security officials involved in the investigation, killing 3 of them. The government responded by sending in the army. Crackdowns and checkpoints ensued, and it was reported that by the 19th of that month, 20 men who had been involved in the attack were now in custody. However, by June of 2014, only 5 of those suspects remained in detention. Militant sources claimed that 1 of the men was involved, whilst the 4 others had been forced to confess under interrogation. On the 27th of February 2015, 2 of the men still being held escaped in a jailbreak. Since that time, no updates on the case seem to have been forthcoming. Details are sketchy, and it appears that the Pakistani authorities, without any prospect of conviction, and still embarrassed by the attack, have decided to let the matter slowly fade away. It seems unlikely that justice will ever be served. Thankfully, there have been no further attacks on high-altitude climbers in the area. But it is a bitter irony that men who had almost daily diced with death on the world's most challenging peaks would die without their climbing boots on, at the hands of men, rather than the peaks of mountains.